The bags were packed. The law school plan was in motion. The city was waiting. And then she walked into a bar in a small Oklahoma town and met a cowboy who barely spoke. And every single thing she thought her life was going to be, gone. Canceled. Traded for mud and cattle and a ranch so remote there was no cell signal for years. And that cowboy? 25 years later, he drove himself to the hospital with a broken neck. Not called an ambulance. Not asked for help. Drove himself. That is who Ree Drummond married. That is the world she chose. And somehow, out of that world, out of butter and brisket, and an Oklahoma wind that never stops blowing, she built one of the most beloved empires in American food television. What does it take to walk away from the life you planned and build something no one saw coming? Anne-Marie Ree Drummond, known to millions as the Pioneer Woman, is 57 years old. She has 5 children. She has a ranch with more than 100,000 acres. She has a television show that has never stopped airing since 2011. She has a store that turned a town of 3,500 people into a destination with hundreds of thousands of visitors a year. She lost more than 50 pounds and told the world exactly how she did it. Without apology, without drama, and without Ozempic. But behind that warm smile and those legendary Sunday roasts lies a story not glamorous, but genuinely extraordinary. A story of a city girl who made an impossible choice, built an empire with her bare hands, and watched the man she loved nearly die on the land they built together. If Ree Drummond's butter biscuits have ever made you feel like everything might be okay, hit like as a tribute to the woman who proved that the most unexpected roads lead to the most remarkable destinations. Because the truth is, the beginning of this legend looks nothing like the ending. Bartlesville, Oklahoma, 1969. Not the place you expect a legend to begin. Not a coastal city with bright lights and an obvious runway toward fame. Not a town anyone outside of Oklahoma would have circled on a map and said, "Yes, that is where something extraordinary will start." Bartlesville was quiet, comfortable, and entirely ordinary to the people who grew up there, and for Anne-Marie Smith, who would only later become Ree, and only later still become the Pioneer Woman, it was simply home. She was born on the 6th of January, 1969. The family she was born into was not struggling. Frank Smith, her father, was a prosperous businessman and an avid golfer, a man of routines and competence and a certain kind of confident ease that comes with financial stability earned and maintained. The Smith household was comfortable in the way that allows children to think forward rather than backward, to plan rather than simply survive. Ree grew up with the expectation that her life would follow a recognizable trajectory. Education, ambition, a city, a career, a future with coordinates that made sense on paper. And for a long time, it was working exactly as planned. She was smart. She was curious. She had the kind of drive that turns plans into action, rather than letting them dissolve into wishful thinking. By the time she reached university, the trajectory was clear. She studied geosyntactic engineering at the University of Southern California, a long way from Bartlesville, a long way from cattle ranches and dusty roads and the particular silence of rural Oklahoma. Los Angeles was everything Bartlesville was not. And after California, the plan had a next chapter. Chicago, law school, a profession, a life in the city, built by her own hands, shaped by her own ambition. She had bought the ticket. That is the detail that matters. Not that she had dreams of Chicago. Lots of people dream. She had the ticket. One way. The bags were being sorted. The plan was not abstract. It was scheduled. And then her brother called. "Come to Pawhuska for a visit," he said. "Just for a while. Just to see family before the next chapter begins." She came. That single decision, a visit, a detour, a pause before the real life was supposed to start, changed every single thing. The city girl who thought she knew exactly where she was going had no idea she was already exactly where she was supposed to be. Pawhuska, Oklahoma. September 1996. It is a town of a particular kind of quiet, the kind that settles into your bones if you let it, the kind that a girl from a comfortable Bartlesville household, freshly sharpened by years in Los Angeles, might look at and think, charming but temporary, a rest stop, a comma in the sentence of a life that was heading somewhere louder and faster and more obviously important. Ree was there to visit her brother. That was all. A family visit before Chicago, before law school, before the version of herself she had been building toward since she was old enough to build toward anything. And then she walked into a bar. His name was Lad Drummond. He was a rancher, a cowboy in the most literal and unromanticized sense of the word. Not the Hollywood version, not the aesthetic, but the actual thing. A man whose life was shaped by land and cattle and the particular discipline of working outdoors in conditions that do not negotiate with human comfort. He was quiet in the way that certain men are quiet. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they have learned that most things do not require saying. He stood in a room the way someone stands when they are entirely comfortable with who they are and entirely uninterested in performing that comfort for anyone else's benefit. Ree Drummond looked at him and later confessed he was, in her own words, the Marlboro Man in the flesh. She was not wrong. Lad Drummond was exactly that image made real. Broad-shouldered, unhurried, rooted in something she had not encountered in Los Angeles or in the polished corridors of university ambition. He was the opposite of everything her planned life contained. And that, it turned out, was precisely the point. They talked. They kept talking. And something shifted in Ree Smith that September night in a bar in Pawhuska, Oklahoma. Something quiet and tectonic that does not announce itself while it is happening, but that you can trace clearly in retrospect. The kind of shift that rewrites the coordinates of a life without asking permission first. They began dating, and here is what makes the timeline remarkable. They met in September of 1996. They married in 1996, the same year, the same turning point year. From a bar in Pawhuska to a wedding in months. For a woman who had a one-way ticket to Chicago already purchased, who had a law career mapped out, who had spent years building toward a specific and entirely different future, the speed of it was either reckless or clarifying, depending on how you look at it. Ree Drummond has always looked at it as clarifying. The ticket to Chicago was canceled, not deferred, not postponed while she figured things out. Canceled. And in its place, a ranch. 8 kilometers outside of Pawhuska, so remote that cell phone signal did not exist there for years. No signal, no city noise, no Los Angeles sprawl, no Chicago ambition corridor, just land and cattle, and Lad Drummond, and the vast and uncompromising Oklahoma sky. The Drummond family, it should be said, is not a small operation. They are one of the largest landowners in the state of Oklahoma, with more than 100,000 acres of cattle ranch. This is not a charming little homestead. This is an empire of land, working and producing and demanding everything from the people who run it, every single day, in every season, without pause. Ree Smith, city girl, California educated, Chicago bound, stepped into that world and stayed. She later admitted that the culture shock was real, that moving from a comfortable city life to one of the most isolated ranches in Oklahoma was not a seamless transition, that there were moments of profound adjustment, of learning a rhythm that had no relationship to anything she had known before. But she also said, clearly, and more than once, that she never looked back. The woman who canceled the ticket to Chicago did not lose a life. She found the one she was actually built for. She just had to walk into the right bar on the right September night to discover it. And if trading a law career for 100,000 acres of Oklahoma ranch sounds like the end of the ambition story, what comes next will make you reconsider everything you think ambition looks like. August 2006. Ree Drummond had been a rancher's wife for a decade. 10 years of cattle and mud, and Oklahoma wind, and the particular rhythm of a life built around land that does not stop demanding things from you simply because you are tired. 10 years of 4 children, Alex, Paige, Bryce, and Todd, raised in a place so remote that the nearest town was a drive away, and the nearest city was a different world entirely. 10 years of cooking, of photographing, of writing in the quiet hours when the ranch was still and the children were asleep, and something in her, the sharp, curious, California-educated woman who had once been heading to law school, needed somewhere to put itself. So, she opened a blog. The name alone tells you everything about who Ree Drummond is and how she has always understood the value of honesty over polish. The pioneer woman, plowing through life in the country. One calf nut at a time. Not glamorous, not carefully branded, not the product of a marketing meeting, just a woman writing about her actual life, the cooking, the photography, the love story with Lad, the chaos and tenderness and dark humor of raising 4 children on one of the most isolated ranches in Oklahoma, with a voice so specific and warm and genuinely funny that the internet, which has always been able to tell the difference between real and performed, responded immediately. People came, and then more people came. And then the kind of people came who give awards. The blog won multiple weblog awards. It was not competing in a small category, it was winning against the full field of personal blogs at a moment when personal blogs were the dominant form of online storytelling. Ree Drummond was not a media professional. She was not backed by a publishing house, or a television network, or a team of content strategists. She was a rancher's wife in rural Oklahoma, writing about her life with a camera and a voice that made strangers feel like they were sitting at her kitchen table. That is the thing that no amount of strategy can manufacture. And that is precisely what William Morrow, one of the most respected publishing imprints in American book history, recognized when they came to her. A cookbook. They wanted a cookbook. The Pioneer Woman Cooks. Recipes from an Accidental Country Girl was published in 2009. It debuted on the New York Times bestseller list immediately. Not eventually. Not after a slow build. Immediately. Because the audience that had been reading the blog for 3 years did not need to be convinced. They already knew what Ree Drummond's recipes tasted like in their imagination, and they wanted them on their shelves. The book did not slow down. It became a fixture. And then, in 2011, Food Network called. The Pioneer Woman as a television series launched on Food Network in 2011. And here is the number that matters most. It is still airing. In 2026, the show continues. More than 15 years on a major American television network, in a media landscape that cancels shows after 1 season without blinking, where audiences fragment and scatter and loyalty is considered a relic, the Pioneer Woman has outlasted trends, algorithm changes, streaming wars, and the complete transformation of how Americans consume food content. It has simply continued to be exactly what it always was: warm, honest, specific, and made by a woman who genuinely means every word she says. But Ree Drummond did not stop at television. Pawhuska, Oklahoma. Population: 3,500 people. A small town that most Americans could not have located on a map, and that most residents of neighboring cities might have driven past without stopping. Ree Drummond opened the Pioneer Woman Mercantile there, a store, a restaurant, a bakery, a destination. Not in Tulsa, not in Oklahoma City, in Pawhuska, because that was where her life was, and she had never once pretended to be something she was not. The mercantile transformed the town. Hundreds of thousands of visitors a year now make the deliberate trip to Pawhuska specifically to walk through her store, eat at her restaurant, stand in the physical space of a story they have been following online and on television for years. A town of 3,500 people became a tourist destination because one woman decided to be honest about her life on a blog in August of 2006. She published more cookbooks, every one of them a bestseller. She launched a kitchen collection: cookware, dishes, linens, the physical objects of the life she had been documenting for 2 decades. She launched a line of clothing. She built, in the most literal sense of the word, an empire. Not from a boardroom in a major city. Not with venture capital and a growth strategy and a team of brand consultants. From a ranch 8 kilometers outside of Pawhuska, Oklahoma, with no cell signal. The woman who canceled her ticket to Chicago did not abandon ambition. She simply relocated it to a place where no one expected ambition to live. And just when the empire was fully built, the land that gave her everything reminded her, in the most terrifying way possible, that nothing is promised, and that the people we love most are always only one moment away from being taken. There are days that divide a life into before and after, not the days that announce themselves in advance, not the weddings and the book launches and the television premieres that you dress for and prepare for and photograph because you know they matter. The days that divide a life into before and after are the ones that arrive without warning, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, dressed as routine. March 2nd, 2021 was a Tuesday. It was fire season on the Drummond Ranch. In Oklahoma, in early March, the dry grass burns fast, and the wind carries embers in directions that cannot be predicted or reasoned with. Fighting range fires is not a dramatic choice on a working cattle ranch. It is simply part of the job, as ordinary and unglamorous as any other task the land demands. Lad Drummond had done it before. He knew the terrain, he knew the equipment, he knew the risk the way a man knows risk when he has lived alongside it for his entire adult life, not with fear, but with the particular calm competence of someone who has always managed to be on the right side of it. On that Tuesday, Lad and his nephew Caleb Drummond, 21 years old, young and strong and fully present in the way that 21-year-olds are present, without the accumulated weight of years that teaches a man to hold something back for emergencies, were working together to fight a grass fire on the ranch. 2 fire trucks, 2 men, the kind of work that is physically demanding and logistically precise, and that has no margin for the unexpected. And then the unexpected arrived. The 2 fire trucks collided. In the chaos and the noise and the dust of fighting a range fire on a vast Oklahoma ranch, with wind and smoke and the particular disorientation that comes with working fast in difficult conditions. The 2 trucks collided. And in a single moment, everything changed. Caleb Drummond was gravely injured. Broken ribs, a severe concussion, multiple other injuries that required immediate and serious medical attention. He was 21 years old, and he had just been through something that his body would spend months recovering from. And Lad Drummond did what cowboys do, what men of his particular formation do. Raised on a ranch where stoicism is not a philosophical position, but simply the grammar of daily life. He assessed himself. He found that he could move. He decided that he was well enough, and he drove himself to the hospital in Tulsa. He drove himself, not called an ambulance, not waited for help, not allowed someone else to take the wheel while he sat in the back, and admitted that something might be seriously wrong. He drove himself, because that is the man Ree Drummond married, and that is the world she entered when she canceled her ticket to Chicago 25 years before. The doctors at Ascension St. John Medical Center in Tulsa found what Lad's stoicism had refused to acknowledge on the drive. His neck was broken, not in one place, in two places, two separate fractures, and the neurosurgeon, Dr. Mohammed Kalani, delivered the information that recontextualized everything. One of the two fractures had been very close to catastrophic. Not serious, not significant, catastrophic. The kind of outcome that does not involve recovery, or rehabilitation, or a story told later with dark humor and relief. The kind of outcome that ends everything. Lad Drummond had driven himself to the hospital with a broken neck, and one of those breaks had been millimeters from changing the entire story. Ree Drummond wrote about it on the blog she had been maintaining since 2006, the same blog that had always been the most honest account of her actual life. The document she had never learned to sanitize into something more comfortable than the truth. She wrote, "Lad broke his neck in two places, and evidently one of the two fractures was very close to being catastrophic. Have I mentioned cowboys don't like to admit when they're hurt?" That last sentence, said with humor, said with love, said by a woman who had just spent the most terrifying hours of her adult life understanding exactly how close she had come to losing the man she had built everything with, and who found, even in that, a way to tell the story with warmth rather than collapse. Dr. Kalani performed the surgery that stabilized Lad's spine. The procedure worked. The recovery was real, and it was hard, and it took the time it needed to take. But Lad Drummond recovered. Completely. The man who drove himself to the hospital with a broken neck walked out of that hospital on the other side of it. A fact that still registers, when you sit with it long enough, as something close to miraculous. And Ree came out of March 2nd, 2021, changed. Not broken, changed. The woman who had always understood that the ranch was demanding and unforgiving and beautiful all at once, now understood it at a different frequency. The land that had given her everything had nearly taken the person without whom none of it meant anything. And that knowledge, the kind that lives in the body rather than the mind, that does not leave when the crisis passes, quietly rearranged her sense of what was real and what was noise. What happens when a woman who has already survived the shock of one life for another suddenly has to reckon with how fragile even the second life can be? 2021 was already a year that had asked everything of Ree Drummond. The fire, the collision, the two broken places in her husband's neck, the surgery, the recovery, the particular exhaustion of a crisis that resolves itself just well enough to leave you standing, shaken, recalibrated, looking at your own life with the kind of clarity that only arrives when something you cannot afford to lose nearly disappears. That kind of year leaves a mark. Not always a visible one, but a mark nonetheless. And it was in that same year, The year that taught her, in the most visceral and irreversible way possible, that time is not guaranteed, and that the people we love most occupy a space in our lives that nothing else can fill. That Ree Drummond began the most personally transformative journey of her public life. She decided to lose weight, not for a magazine, not for a television contract, not because a network executive suggested it, or a stylist flagged it, or a publicist calculated that it would generate a specific kind of media attention. She decided, privately, internally, in the way that real decisions are made, which is quietly and without announcement, that she was going to change something fundamental about how she was living inside her own body. What followed was a transformation of more than 50 pounds. 50 pounds. On a woman who had spent 15 years on national television cooking with butter and cream and cast iron and the full, unapologetic joy of food made without reservation. On a woman whose entire brand, whose entire identity in the public eye, was built around the pleasure of cooking and eating and feeding people without guilt or calculation. The transformation was visible, impossible to miss. And the internet, which is never quiet about the bodies of women in the public eye, was not quiet about this one. The speculation was immediate and loud. Ozempic, Wegovy, one of the new generation of weight loss medications that had, by 2024, become simultaneously the most discussed pharmaceutical development in American culture and the most assumed explanation for any significant weight loss by any public figure anywhere. The assumption was not malicious. It was simply the reflexive conclusion of a moment in which those medications were genuinely everywhere, genuinely transforming bodies, genuinely changing what was possible for millions of people who had spent years struggling. But it was not Ree's story. In 2024, she addressed it directly, not defensively, not with the particular brittle energy of someone who feels accused of something, with the same plain-spoken honesty that had made a blog about calf nuts into a television empire. She wrote, on the same blog she had been writing since 2006, "I did not take Ozempic, Wegovy, or similar medications. I know this has been a big topic in recent years, so I thought I'd add this paragraph." Just that, clear, unambiguous. And then, because this is who Ree Drummond has always been, immediately followed by something that had nothing to do with defensiveness and everything to do with genuine human decency. She wrote, "I support anyone who has success using the above medications. I know they have been an absolute godsend for so many people." And then, "Today, even though I have gained a few pounds up and down, I still have not chosen that option, but you'll never hear a second of judgment from me about people who choose that direction." Read those sentences again. A woman who has just clarified, publicly on the record to millions of followers, that she did not use a medication that was being widely assumed about her, immediately and without hesitation redirected the entire conversation toward supporting the people who did. No hierarchy, no superiority, no implication that her path was more virtuous or more difficult or more worthy of admiration than anyone else's. Just a woman being honest about her own experience while refusing, absolutely refusing, to use that honesty as a platform for judgment. That is the thing that the 50 pounds never quite captured on its own. The number is dramatic, the transformation is visible, but the character revealed in how she talked about it. That is the part that tells you who Ree Drummond actually is underneath the television show, and the mercantile and the cookbooks, and the empire built from butter and brisket. She made changes to her diet. She made changes to her lifestyle. She did the work in the way that work gets done when there is no shortcut being offered and no shortcut being sought. Consistently, privately, over time, With the same unglamorous discipline that runs an Oklahoma cattle ranch through every season, regardless of whether the season is cooperative. And the results were real and lasting and hers. The transformation generated enormous media attention, cover stories, online commentary, the particular cultural moment that happens when a beloved public figure changes visibly, and the audience that has been watching for 15 years suddenly sees something different and needs to understand it. Ree gave them the understanding they needed, directly, warmly, and without drama. Because drama was never her register, honesty was. And at 57 years old, with 50 pounds gone and a husband whose neck had healed, and a ranch that kept demanding everything, what does the woman who built an empire from nothing actually look like now? There is a particular kind of life that only becomes visible in its full dimension when you step back far enough to see all of it at once. Not the television show, not the bestseller list, not the mercantile or the cookware line or the clothing collection or the blog that started everything on a quiet August night in 2006 when a rancher's wife in rural Oklahoma decided to write honestly about her life. All of that is real, and all of that matters, and none of it is the whole story. The whole story is a family. Ree and Ladd Drummond have 5 children, and the way those 5 children came into the family and who they have become is itself a portrait of a woman whose values have always been larger than her brand. Alex is the eldest. She married Maurizio Scott, and in 2024, she gave Ree and Ladd their first grandchild. Ree Drummond, the woman who canceled a ticket to Chicago in 1996, who built an empire from a blog, who watched her husband drive himself to the hospital with a broken neck, became a grandmother. The word sits differently on her than it does on the imagined version of what a grandmother is supposed to look like. She is 57 years old. She is still filming, still writing, still running a ranch, still operating a store that draws hundreds of thousands of visitors a year to a town of 3,500 people. And she is a grandmother, fully, joyfully, without any of the cultural hedging that sometimes accompanies that identity for women who are also still very publicly themselves in other dimensions of their lives. And there is more coming. Alex is expecting a second child, a girl, anticipated in the final months of 2026. Another grandchild, another layer of the life that rebuilt by saying yes to a cowboy in a bar when every rational plan she had made pointed somewhere else entirely. Paige, Bryce, and Todd, the middle children, each shaped by the particular education of growing up on a working cattle ranch in rural Oklahoma, learning from the time they were small that the land does not accommodate laziness or self-pity, that mornings start before comfort is available, and that the family around you is the most reliable thing the world contains. And then there is Jamar. Jamar Drummond is the 5th child, and his story inside this family is perhaps the most quietly powerful thing Ree Drummond has never made into a television moment, or a blog headline, or a piece of branded content. Jamar came to the Drummond family as a child in foster care. They welcomed him, they raised him, they adopted him. He is their son. Not as a footnote, not as a philanthropic gesture documented for public approval, but as a member of a family on a ranch in Oklahoma, where belonging has always been demonstrated through presence and daily life rather than announced through words. The Drummond family simply expanded to include him, and then they let that be the whole story. No performance, no spotlight, no carefully produced emotional reveal. Just a family that got bigger because there was room and love enough to make it bigger. That is who these people are. The Pioneer Woman television show continues on Food Network in 2026, more than 15 years after it first aired. still drawing audiences who find in Ree's kitchen the particular warmth of something genuine in a media landscape that has become increasingly skilled at manufacturing the appearance of genuineness without the substance. The mercantile in Pawhuska continues to operate. The store, the restaurant, the bakery, the destination that transformed a small Oklahoma town into a place people drive hours to visit because they want to stand inside the physical reality of a story they have been following online for 2 decades. The cookbooks keep selling. The social media presence, built on the same honesty that built the blog, the same voice that made strangers feel like neighbors, continues to reach millions of people who follow not because they are being marketed to, but because they genuinely want to know what Ree Drummond is cooking this week and how Lad is doing, and whether the grandchildren have arrived yet. And through all of it, the empire, and the television, and the store, and the books, and the followers, and the awards, and the attention, the ranch remains. 8 kilometers outside of Pawhuska, more than 100,000 acres. The same land that Ree Smith walked onto in 1996 when she was 27 years old and had just canceled a ticket to Chicago and had no idea that she was not giving up a future, but finding one. The land that nearly took Lad on a Tuesday in March of 2021. The land that demanded everything, every day, in every season, without negotiation. The land that is also, and has always been, the most honest account of who Ree Drummond is underneath every other version of herself the world has been offered. She has never left it. She has never wanted to. Because the woman who once stood in a bar in Pawhuska and made the most improbable decision of her life has spent the 30 years since proving, quietly and consistently, and without ever needing to announce it, that improbable decisions made from the right place always lead exactly where they are supposed to. Here is what the full picture looks like. A girl from Bartlesville, Oklahoma, born on the 6th of January, 1969. Raised in comfort, educated in California, pointed toward Chicago and a law career and the kind of life that makes complete and obvious sense when you lay the pieces out in order. She had ambition. She had a plan. She had a ticket. And then, September 1996. A bar in Pawhuska. A cowboy who barely spoke. A decision made not from logic, but from something older and more reliable than logic. The kind of recognition that a person either trusts or spends the rest of their life explaining away. She trusted it. What followed was not a fairy tale. Fairy tales do not include fire trucks colliding on a cattle ranch or a husband driving himself to a hospital in Tulsa with 2 broken places in his neck, or the quiet terror of learning that one of those breaks had been very close to the kind of outcome that does not have a recovery chapter. Fairy tales do not include 50 pounds lost through the unglamorous discipline of daily choices made privately, without shortcuts, over months and years. Fairy tales do not include the culture shock of trading a California education and a Chicago future for a ranch so remote it had no cell signal for years. Real life includes all of that. And real life, Ree Drummond's real life, also includes something that fairy tales rarely manage. It includes a woman who built something genuinely extraordinary while remaining, at every step, genuinely herself. The blog that became a television show. The television show that never went away. The store that turned a town of 3,500 people into a destination visited by hundreds of thousands every year. The cookbooks, the kitchen collection, the clothing line, the grandchildren arriving, the first in 2024, the second expected in 2026, a girl, another layer of a life that keeps expanding outward from that single decision made in a bar in 1996. 5 children. 100,000 acres, 15 years on national television, and through all of it, the same voice, the same warmth, the same refusal to be anything other than exactly who she is, whether she is writing about calf nuts on a blog in 2006 or clarifying her weight loss journey to millions of followers in 2024 with a sentence that manages to be honest about her own experience while extending nothing but grace toward everyone who made a different choice. That is the thing that outlasts the numbers and the bestseller lists and the cable ratings. That is the thing that made strangers feel like they were sitting at her kitchen table before she was famous and kept them sitting there for 20 years after. Not the butter, not the brisket, not the cast iron or the Oklahoma sunsets or the television lighting that makes the Drummond Ranch look like the most beautiful place in America, though it might be. The thing that made Ree Drummond into the pioneer woman was simply this: she never pretended. Not about the culture shock of moving to a remote ranch, not about the terror of March 2nd, 2021, not about the 50 pounds, or how she lost them, or what she thinks about the people who lost theirs a different way, not about the grandchildren she did not expect to have at 57, because the version of herself that was heading to Chicago in 1996 had not yet met the cowboy who would make grandchildren possible. She never pretended. And in a world that has become extraordinarily skilled at the performance of authenticity, at manufacturing the appearance of honesty without the discomfort of the real thing, that is rarer than any empire and worth more than any bestseller list. If Ree Drummond's story has ever made you believe that the life you did not plan can be more extraordinary than the one you did, leave a tribute for the pioneer woman in the comments below. Because she earned it. On a ranch in Oklahoma, 30 years ago, with a canceled ticket and a cowboy who barely spoke, and the kind of courage that does not look like courage at the time, but that the whole rest of a life eventually reveals. What does her story say to you about the plans we make and the lives that find us anyway? And if you have stayed with this story from Bartlesville to Pawhuska, from the blog to the Food Network, from the broken neck to the grandchildren, subscribe. Because there are more stories like this one, and every single one of them is worth your time.